welcome to Roundtable. I'm your host, Adam Cook. On this week's show, you're going to hear from Fred Tilley, the Nova Scotia Liberal Party's finance critic, about the process that went into the latest provincial budget presented by the PC government. And we'll also speak to Veronica Merryfield, the head of the Cape Breton Transgender Network. Our special guest interviewer, Taylor Linloff, is going to talk to Veronica Merryfield about Trans Day of Visbility. But we begin with a visit to the Port Hawkesbury Civic Centre to see how the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce unveiled its annual State of the Strait Conference. You're going to hear from several people who took part in the presentations, and we begin by hearing the opening remarks from the president of the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce, John Willett.
The Strait Area Chamber of Commerce supports businesses in the counties of Richmond, Inverness, Victoria, Guysborough, and Antigonish, and the town of Port Hawkesbury. Our members run the gamut from a single business owner to some of our largest employers. We host networking events like the one we're at today. We celebrate the accomplishments of our members. We offer member services. We promote the region as a great place to live and work. And we often act as a clearinghouse for business opportunities and help connect members to services they need and to one another. We advocate on behalf of our members to all levels of government to make sure we are creating a growth-friendly environment for business. Today we gather to get a sense of the state of the Strait, and there is much to be excited about. The opening up of our tourism economy, the growth of our arts and cultural sectors, the expansion of local small businesses, the achievements of our large employers like Port Hawkesbury Paper, the work being done by NSCC to prepare the workforce of the future, and I think there's a full table of students from NSCC here today. I know we're talking about attracting and retaining a labor market, so if anybody's looking for people, there's a whole table of them over there. The exciting focus on wind energy by Everwind, by Bearhead and Northland, and all the other international players looking at Nova Scotia as a leader in the production and export of green energy. So the state of the Strait is focused on growth, and growth comes with challenges. Housing, finding and retaining labor, how to partner with our First Nations. There is a lot of work to do, and time and again our region demonstrates that business, community, and government can work together to sustainably grow our region. A great example of this working together is the Strait of Canso Offshore Wind Task Force. And I think there's a one-pager on in front of everybody about the task force, where business, government, and the community are focused on supporting the transformational opportunity offered to us and to the world by the energy that can be harnessed here off our coast. So, on behalf of the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce, I'd like to thank you for being part of the effort to do this hard work. Thank you to our sponsors and to our speakers today. Please participate, share ideas, support one another. There's a reason that Premier Houston mentioned the Strait at least 3 times in his State of the Province address earlier this year in Sydney. And that reason, in my mind, is our attitude and our willingness to get things done.
Among the first things to be done at the Chamber's State of the Strait Conference, a Mi'kmaq land acknowledgement by Chamber President John Willett, and then a traditional Indigenous song by a councillor for Member 2 First Nation, who was also Member 2's Partnerships Coordinator and a founding member of the Sons of Member 2 drum group, George Marshall.
Hey-ya, hey-ya, hey-yo, hey-ya, hey-ya, hey-ya. Hey-ya, 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 hey-yo.
From there, it's on to the first panel of the conference, Pathways to Economic Reconciliation, led by Waikama-based President and CEO of Indigenous Guide Consulting Services, Robert Bernard.
We wanted to welcome you here on behalf of our Mi'kmaq people. We're very happy that you have come today.
The significance of this panel and the ceremonies that precede it aren't lost on participants in the State of the Strait conference, including Cape Breton Partnership CEO and President Tyler Mathis and the Warden of Richmond County, Amanda Mumbercat.
Some of that learning around, in the first panel around the Indigenous engagement and to be not afraid to ask questions and to make sure that that engagement is meaningful. And I know from our council's perspective that has definitely been something that we want to do and that we want to continue to be working at with our neighbors in Budladek and other neighboring communities in Unama'ki.
I always get a great education when someone like Robert Bernard or Graham Marshall come to the front. We have a lot to learn from our Indigenous partners. They are showing leadership, they're showing poise and professionalism, and they're showing a willingness to teach. And so while some of the words I'd heard before, every time you hear them again, it sinks in more deeply. And I was really impressed with the Chamber having them not only welcome us, but really set the tone on that topic of economic prosperity for all and a respect for the Indigenous peoples in the Mi'kmaq, in Unama'ki here. And so I think that was really interesting. I think their leadership and their true partnership was inspiring, and I think we need to keep on hearing those messages over and over, so that not only we have a better relationship, but that we have more prosperity.
Next up, the Labor Challenges and Opportunities panel. This discussion was headed up by Eleanor Anderson, who's the project manager for the Cape Breton Island Tourism Training Network and a faculty member for the Shannon School of Business at Cape Breton University.
Whenever you get invited by a Chamber of Commerce, especially one as active and engaged and progressive as the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce, you want to participate. So it was an honor to be asked. And then secondly, I guess, is the importance of what we do for the tourism sector. You know, this area is the gateway to Cape Breton, so has been welcoming visitors for a very long time. Lots of businesses here depend on tourism, so we offer a tourism training suite, and it's free of charge. A federally government-funded tourism recovery project is what we're doing. So it's a very opportune time for us to be here. The sector's still recovering, and that's important to be here for them.
A familiar face shows up for the next panel. Damien McGuinness is the operator of Collindale Business Solutions in Inverness County. But he recently made a splash at the Nova Scotia Community College's Strait Area campus with a $100 million funding commitment from various partners for a new housing development for Port Hastings. It will concentrate on student housing needs in the early goings and be known as Straightville. Even before McInnes gave his presentation at the State of the Strait conference, he was already attracting attention from other parts of Cape Breton Island.
Straightville is a perfect example. It's a housing development that this region hasn't seen in quite some time, but one that's very common in other parts of the country. So we're able to take expertise from other parts of the country or the world, marry them with a resilient workforce and construction and development acumen here, and we've got a great project moving forward. So that's absolutely, both strengths are necessary, outside and homegrown.
Along with the hype surrounding the Straightville housing development in Port Hastings, State of the Strait conference participants got an update about maritime launch services plans to set up a spaceport in southeastern Guysborough County, and the project's potential for Canso and the surrounding areas, as well as the whole Strait region, caught the attention of a former Strait Area Chamber of Commerce president who also once served on Port Hawkesbury Town Council.
What I was really impressed was the fact that something like the spaceport in Canso, where they poured concrete this week. I've been watching that project since Mike Mattier started it back, I don't know, it's 5-6 years ago it seems. And now to hear that they're actually getting to the point of breaking ground and pouring concrete, man, that's encouraging.
We'll wrap things up with a keynote address from David Campbell of Jupia Consulting, a well-known economist, as well columnist, and one of the hosts of Atlantic Insights podcast.
Immediately following this lunchtime keynote address that takes a deep dive on statistics relating to Cape Breton's employment numbers and its labor force, a farewell announcement, not just for the State of the Strait conference itself, but for outgoing Executive Director of the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce, Misty McDonald.
This is my last official function as Executive Director of the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce. And before I leave the role at the end of March to pay some much needed attention to my own business, I wanted to take a moment to thank several people who have made the past few years an absolute pleasure to be in this role. When I took this role, it was during the pandemic, and I have to say that it's been very exciting times, because here we were in the middle of this pandemic, nobody knew what was going to happen, and really nothing was happening. Dean Hart, who was the president at the time, was very concerned about the events that we were trying to plan, and he rightfully so called it when we had to shut down in the middle of repeating lockdowns. So it was definitely challenging times to be trying to run events for the Chamber. And then the tides just turned, as none of us knew, and now here we are talking about housing challenges, labor challenges. In early 2021, I remember getting the phone call from Tyler saying, there's been an acquisition of New Star Terminals, and we had just started talking about the potential for wind energy and lots of things. So to say the least, it's been a really interesting couple of years here. So the people I'd like to thank, so first of all, past President Dean Hart, my current President John Willett, and the Board of Directors of the Strait Area Chamber. Having the support of a strong and diversified board has been instrumental in guiding the organization, and having presidents that lead with equal measures of fairness and kindness has been truly a gift. There's two past presidents and chamber members that give us so much support, and they're always willing to lend a hand and an ear when needed. They have to be mentioned. So thank you so much to Bob McCachran of Maple Signs and Engraving and to Larry McKeegan of Trimac Toyota. They go well above and beyond. Our physical location is a space that's shared with our partners in economic development, who are not only respected colleagues, but also true friends. Always willing to help, dispense advice, and participate in thoughtful and engaging conversations, I have benefited immensely from their mentorship and their friendship. Karen and Wanda are the best office mates anyone could ask for. And we also have amazing partner organizations here in Nova Scotia, too many to name, but a special mention does need to go to the Cape Breton Partnership, who under Tyler's leadership have been willing to collaborate on every front and truly showcase every day that we are all better together. And the biggest shout out of all has to go to Susan Fox, our membership and events coordinator, who really, anybody who's a member of the chamber knows, Susan is the engine that keeps that chamber going. I can't even express how lucky the whole chamber membership is to have someone in a staff role who truly believes in the chamber mandate and goes above and beyond to ensure we are able to service a strong membership and host amazing events. There are no words to express my appreciation for such a fantastic coworker and friend. I will have you here all afternoon if I keep going, but it's a big thank you to everybody, all the members at large. It's been an honor to get to know them, their businesses, and to represent their interest in the Strait area.
The significance of Misty McDonald's departure from the Chamber's Executive Director chair wasn't lost on a former Executive Director who now serves as the Warden of Richmond County and District 4 Councillor Amanda Mumbercat.
I know what that feeling is like, and it's so funny because I think 3 years ago it was me giving that very same speech at this very same event. The State of the Strait was the last event that I took in as the Chamber Executive Director, and it was a bit of an emotional moment, and I'm sure she was feeling the same way, but also an opportunity for the Chamber to get some fresh ideas and fresh perspective in a new ED. So I'm sure for Misty it's bittersweet as it was for me a few years back.
And as this day of hellos and goodbyes wound down at the Port Hawkesbury Civic Centre, participants in the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce 2023 State of the Strait Conference came away with a recognition of how the local business community has overcome its past struggles, is having success in the present, and can step forward to continue that success well into the future. In Port Hawkesbury for Roundtable on Tilley Community Television, I'm Adam Cook. Now, you'll probably recognize the two people that you're about to see here on Roundtable. That's because you might have seen them at the tail end of our opening sequence for the show. They are local LGBTQIA activist Taylor Linloff and the head of the Cape Breton Transgender Network, Veronica Merryfield.
Hello, my name is Taylor Linloff, and thank you for tuning in to Tilley today. Today we are with Veronica Merryfield, and we'll be talking about a very important date that's upcoming on Friday the 31st, which is Transgender Day of Visibility.
Hi Taylor, thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here.
My name's Veronica Merryfield, and I run the Cape Breton Transgender Network, amongst other things. And it's a pleasure to be here to talk about the Transgender Day of Visibility.
So for those who aren't familiar, what is the Transgender Day of Visibility?
So the Transgender Day of Visibility happens on March 31st each year to highlight or help the community be visible, to highlight the issues that the community has, and to celebrate celebrate ourselves effectively, celebrate the transgender community.
For those who aren't familiar with trans advocacy or even really terminology, what does it mean to be transgender?
So transgender is a term that's used for somebody whose gender identity doesn't necessarily match the sex that they were assigned at birth.
Thank you. And how can people celebrate Transgender Day of Visibility?
Well, there's a couple of events locally that you could go to. There's a flag raising in Sydney at 11 o'clock outside the CBRM Municipal Building. There's also a flag raising in Ignish at 11:30 on Friday, Friday the 31st, at the Flag Plaza at the St. FX. But it would be good to know that people are educating themselves, spend a bit of time learning about what it means to be transgender, learn a bit about the kind of things that transgender people have to go through, to learn what youth have to go through, to understand that children in hostile families have a very difficult time to learn what it means to be or have gender dysphoria, that deep-seated feeling that your gender is not correct, and how hard that is to live with until you can get gender-affirming care.
Yeah, for those who don't know, I am also transgender myself. I identify as non-binary, which means I don't identify as male and or female. I fit outside the box. And why, to bounce off that, why is it important that we acknowledge Trans Day of Visibility?
It's important to me and it's important to the community because without that kind of visibility and representation, those sections of the community, those the people that suffer with gender dysphoria, would largely go unseen. My own story with gender starts as a 4-year-old, where I came to the understanding that the gender I felt myself to be was not what everybody else was kind of expecting or treating me as. And I didn't know what that was, and I didn't know what the language was. And it wasn't until I was nearly 18 before I even came across somebody else anywhere that expressed the same issues and feelings that I had. And to have gone so many years without even knowing what it was, to feel so alone and unsupported was incredibly difficult. And I don't want that happening to anybody else. I want trans people, non-binary people to know that it's okay. And that particularly affects children and youth.
Yeah. There's been a lot of, I don't want to say controversy, I want to say violence happening around the world in regards to trans people and gender diverse expressions. And the thing that came to mind when you were saying that, talking about trans youth and children, there's been a lot of drag performers having to wear shirts that say protect and support trans youth and children due to the violence that, especially currently happening in the States, due to anti-drag queen laws, anti-gender expression laws. And do you think this could happen here?
It's already happening here. So yes, in the US, there's currently 460 pieces of state-based legislation that are against the 2S LGBTQ+ community in a number of ways. We heard earlier in the year about Don't Say Gay in Florida. There's some fairly draconian pieces of legislation in that allow the state to remove children from families who are seeking gender-affirming care, whether they're in the state that the law is being enacted in or out of state, or if those families go into that state. The pushback against drag artists has happened in Canada. It happened last year at the Pride celebrations in Sydney with a protest that was happening at the same time as the drag story time was happening. So it's not just outside of Canada that these things are happening, and the pressure is coming within Canada and from outside Canada.
For those who want to practice allyship and use being an ally as a verb, how can allies ally people who want to ally? How can they support us? How can they protect us?
So the first thing that any good ally will do is educate themselves. And I say to people, if you can't educate yourself, find somebody who is willing to educate yourself, but don't just assume that somebody who's transgender is going to be up for doing that education. For most of us, we have to, or we find ourselves in positions of having to educate people when we're trying to access service. And that education takes a huge toll, particularly in emotional labour that needs to be done to impart that education in spaces where we really don't expect to have to do it. But there are those of us, myself included, who are quite happy to do that kind of education so that the person who's seeking the education isn't seeking it from somebody else who deserves to be interacted with somebody that has that education. Supporting, being an advocate, supporting people in the community, particularly when those people aren't present. So those conversations that happen without somebody from the 2S LGBT community, somebody who isn't transgender in the room, when those conversations are happening, an advocate will stand up for that. And that's where the real allyship comes. The allyship, when you're with somebody who's transgender, is not the same as the allyship that happens when there's nobody there. And then helping to promote those who are transgender in the community or in the workplace, getting them to the table, getting them to have a voice, allowing that voice to be heard and encouraging that voice. Taking note when somebody says something, they say it from a point of lived experience. And that lived experience is very, very real. Those are the kind of things that allies can do, and that's where allyship really scores.
You talked about promotion, bring us to the table, and that leads to my next topic I want to talk to. And it's about representation. A phrase or a quote that often comes up with Trans Day of Remembrance, which I talked about you last time, and Trans Day of Visibility is, give us a roses while we're still here. How can representation, recognizing ourselves in the media, in everyday situations, in stories, TV, role models, how can that affect people who are transgender or non-binary? That's
a very good question, and it has a lot of parts to it. The phrase that I often use is nothing about us without us, i.e. if legislations or policies or conversations are happening without us that will affect us, those are not cool because they don't have the representation at the table to voice the concerns over those kind of things. And that happens for any community. Whilst we're here talking about Transgender Day of Visibility, and we're shining that lens on the trans experience, the idea of having all of those lenses at the table when they're represented particularly over pieces of legislation that happen without us it's important that we're there. So for Nova Scotians, that would be things like healthcare. Transgender healthcare should be enacted with using the voices of those of us who have that direct lived experience accessing healthcare. And this is where representation in places becomes important. In everyday life, we know from the census that there's a lot of Nova Scotians who are transgender or non-binary. We live, and we have that right to live in communities the same as anybody else does, but we're often that hidden minority that doesn't get to be represented at the table over things that affect us.
I know from experience that, especially with healthcare, it's extremely difficult to maneuver it's difficult. The misgendering, the assumptions about what we need for care, it's awful. It's a horrible, invalidating experience a lot of the time.
It is a very invalidating experience. And it all starts, I think, from the idea that the transgender non-binary journey has a very dictated path as it goes through healthcare, whereas somebody's individual journey is their own individual journey. And there's that forcing of gatekeeping that has to be got through. So part of the advocacy work that I do with individuals is how to navigate the health system in such a way to make it work for their individual journey, when the journey that they have to take through healthcare is very much dictated in terms of its pathway. But even accessing that health care is incredibly difficult and made all the worse by not having a family physician. So people who are trans or non-binary trying to access those various pieces of healthcare have to go through justifying why they should be getting that piece of healthcare to somebody new each time. And then the lack of education, particularly in frontline workers who are not necessarily medically trained, presents extra difficulties. And on top of that, things like the MSI forms, take a very long time to make name changes if you can afford to do a name change, and then don't allow for your name that you are going by to be used if your MSI registration details are different from that. Currently, it still costs around $360 for somebody to do a name change, and for some members of the community, that's an expense that becomes a significant barrier. And that barrier then presents in every other aspect of their life because they can't get that name recognised, let alone their pronouns.
Yeah, there was a case in the US, I cannot remember which state, where a transgender individual got laughed at by a receptionist at a medical office because he was a transgender man and his ID was still required to show that his dead name, his assigned gender, prior gender expression. And the receptionist just went, "This can't be you." And he just goes, "Yeah, I'm transgender," and had to out himself.
Yeah. That happens in Canada too, and that happens in Nova Scotia. It happens in Cape Breton. I fairly routinely get calls from those that I'm supporting that have encountered this kind of issue when trying to access healthcare. And if it's not that kind of overt pushback, it's that kind of subverted sniggers behind hands and closed doors that happens, which is dehumanizing. And you would expect so much better from so-called health professionals. It's not professional.
No, we're not spectacle. If we're in a medical scenario, we're either trying to get care for whatever reason, or at worst, we could be in severe distress, and that just adds to it.
It does add to it. And this points to me that there's a distinct lack of visibility and representation with those who work in the health service. And this is where that kind of representation really makes a difference. It makes a difference when people that are alongside us start to learn around sort of water cooler talk about the daily struggles that we have. And that's if we feel able to talk about that kind of stuff around the water cooler. For a lot of people, that doesn't happen either. The pressure to stay hidden in the worst kind of possible ways is destructive. Now, obviously, there are some people who do want to just get on and live their lives and be ordinary people, which, you know, it's absolutely fine. That's their right. But to be penalised if they are out or known, or to be penalised if they're just trying to live their lives, is a dreadful state of affairs. And we're sitting here in relative comfort and protection in Canada. There are other places in the world that we couldn't have this conversation for the risk of being stoned or imprisoned. And we're seeing laws in certain countries that are heading in that direction, that they're heading that wrong way in terms of human rights.
Yeah. I also want to recognize that Veronica and I have white privilege as well, so our experiences of being transgender or non-binary is very, very different to people who are two-spirit, Black, otherwise Indigenous, and people of color as well.
Exactly, that kind of intersectionality just exponentially increases the risk and stigmatization that people get within sections of their community. And it's, again, that's real. There's this, when I do some of my EDI teaching, I talk about how HR is sometimes done by checkbox. And if somebody can tick off a transgender single mum in a wheelchair, it gets them those 3 or 4 checkboxes, which is not the way that representation, visibility, and diversity should be happening.
No, we're often tokenized as the...
We are often tokenized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I'm very open about being non-binary because in a way I have to be, because I have to keep coming out and coming out and coming out over and over and over again.
Right.
Because otherwise I'll just get misgendered. And it makes you wonder, especially when you're like applying for jobs or applying for housing or anything like that, or grants, and they ask you to self-identify. It makes you wonder, it's like, am I going to be the token trans person, or are they going to use this to discriminate against me?
Yeah, and you know, that it's always more than in the back of your mind that the discrimination is going to happen because of that. And we see that with in kind of housing, right? So people that need to access sorry, Adam, what's the word for housing when it's being supplied by
Affordable housing, or
not even that, sheltered?
Okay.
3, 2, 1. So we see that when we find people that are trying to access sheltered housing, which is usually segregated by sex, that people that are trans or non-binary have a very difficult time finding that kind of housing, which means it's no surprise that you find a significant portion of the those who are living on the street are part of the 2S LGBTQ plus community, because they're not welcomed, they are discriminated against, despite policies that say that they shouldn't be. The very act of setting up those kind of housing projects end up being sex segregated.
Yeah, and there's been news reports in the past of trans people who were excluded from houseless and homeless shelters due to being transgender because they did not fit into the category of the shelters, and they unfortunately died from the elements. And people don't realize that we have targets on our backs. Like, people want to kill us. And it's scary. Like, I am a white, femme, woman presenting person, and I still have a target on my back.
Yep. We all have a target on our back to somebody. And to think that this doesn't happen in Cape Breton is a misnomer. There are things happening at the moment in Sydney around housing, shelters and affordable housing that are discriminating against those who have a homeless history and are trans. And then if you are homeless, trying to access healthcare, because you don't have a fixed address, you don't have a way of being contacted by health professionals, means that you're falling out of that system too. So it's no good talking about the small gaps in these kind of support mechanisms they're huge chasms that people are dropping into and find incredibly difficult to get pulled out of.
And it's not just adults who are suffering under this system. Just, was it this year, I believe, there were threats made against the Sydney CBRM queer prom. So people were making valid violence threats against literal children and youth who wanted to go and just have fun with their friends, exist as the gender they were meant to be, to go have fun, dance. And there were literal grown-up people who thought it'd be funny or valid to threaten them and say, your happiness doesn't matter.
So if we're going to talk about that subject, the last few times, over the last year and a half, 2 years that I've appeared in the media, I've got anonymous death threats in my email over just speaking out on transgender subjects, speaking out on having events and why those events are happening. And it's somebody very definitely from Cape Breton who is part of some sort of organisation. Apparently it's been investigated, but I haven't heard there's a conclusive solution to this. I haven't heard that anybody has been reprimanded or brought to justice over that, and I'm fully expecting that in simply having this interview go out on TV, that I'll probably get another anonymous death threat. To threaten youth events with what were deemed to be credible threats to both the organisers and the youth resulted in quite a large police presence at that event, just to allow those youth to be safe, for just to be who they are. We're not talking about the States, we're not talking about anywhere else in the world, we're talking about on our own doorstep.
Sorry, I just lost where I was. Sorry, Adam. That was an emotional moment, lost where I was.
Hang on a minute.
Yeah.
Okay.
And a lot of articles online, especially when these kind of things happen, talk about like how to self-care when you're transgender, or how to self-care as a non-cis person. But how can you practice self-care? How can you simply dissociate yourself from how everything's going on? We don't need self-care, we need community care.
Bingo, we need community care. Those that tell us that we need to practice self-care don't understand that the pressure we find ourselves under all the time, it doesn't go away. So we need community care, the same as any other equity-deserving section of the community needs community care. And we talk about equity sometimes in very glib terms, but it requires active participation by the communities to stand up for, support, and see the issues that are happening. And that brings us fairly back to why March the 31st as Transgender Day of Visibility exists. If we're not here talking about this in a very visible way, people don't know about that, in the same way that if somebody has some other access limiting disability, they need the community to rally around them. And this idea of accessibility for all requires community for all.
One last thing I want to ask is, there is such a perpetual myth that being transgender is a mental illness. And the reality is that it's not. We do not have a mental illness by being transgender. But the thing is, a lot of trans people and non-binary people often have to live with a mental illness, often anxiety due to the trauma we faced.
Right,
and how can we acknowledge that? Like, how can we support ourselves being, like in my case, I am very open. I have bipolar disorder, I'm also autistic. But how can we acknowledge that being transgender isn't a mental illness without vilifying people who are mentally ill?
I think you need to change the conversation away to looking at the trauma and trauma-informed. Those of us who have had to spend our early childhoods hiding who we are because of the way that society expects or dictates certain aspects of society to be or behave or present creates an enormous amount of traumatization that never gets handled. It becomes internalized. And that internalization stops us being able to be who we are. Being transgender is not a new thing. There's a considerable wealth of history in the kind of Western world, from the origins in the kind of like the Middle East, with our kind of history from Israel, for instance. Going back into ancient Egypt, there were documented cases of people being transgender. The interesting thing, or the difficult thing about tracking that kind of stuff, is the evolution of language. It means that going backwards with language is hard to find. For instance, the term transgender is reasonably modern. When I transitioned 30 years ago, the terminology was transsexual, coined by Dr. Harry Benjamin in the 1940s and 50s. But you go back before that with some of the documented history, those terms didn't exist. And if you go back 2, 3, 4, 5,000 years, those terms didn't exist. However, that terminology does exist in even older cultures. So First Nation cultures, for instance, the Cree, have words for the different aspects of being two-spirited, which includes being transgender, that go back 10,000 years. So this is not the new fad that everybody would have us believing. I think one of the reasons it's considered to be a mental health issue has two parts to it. One part would be because it was included in the DSM, the book or the guidebook that's used by mental health professionals, which has included it for many years, but it's dropping out. But I think it's also used by factions of the community that want to see harm or non-treatment for those that do have or deserve gender-affirming care, as a way of stopping that from happening.
Yeah, you look back at ancient Jewish texts and there's actual terms for different genders.
There are different terms for different genders in the Jewish texts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my very last question this time is, was there anything I haven't touched on that you'd like to talk about, or is there anything you'd like to add?
I would love to see people turn out and support the flag raisings that we mentioned earlier. So once again, that's 11 o'clock in Sydney, outside the CBRM building on Esplanade, or at 11:30 in Ignish at St. Evax. But if anybody's got any questions that we haven't answered here, please feel free to reach out. I'm relatively easy to find. The Cape Breton Transgender Network is the site that I operate. Its web address is cbtn.ca, and you can find how to contact me there. I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm available for teaching and educating at all sorts of levels of EDI. But I thank you for watching this, for listening, for going away and educating yourself. And thank you, Taylor, for doing this interview.
Thank you. And for those who may not be able to go to the flag raisings due to location or anything like that, there are almost always posts on Facebook, Instagram, from trans people, organizations, etc., that you can share, that you can read and absorb so that you can learn. You don't have to physically be at a location at a flag raising, because we learn every day.
And wrapping up this edition of Roundtable, we're pleased to welcome back to the show the Liberal MLA for Northside Westmount, Fred Tilley. He is also the Liberal Party's caucus chair in the legislature, so we have a few questions about what's coming up in the legislature session that just got underway. But we're also going to hear from Tilley because he is the finance critic for the Liberal Party, and he has a few things to say about the process that Finance Minister Alan McMaster had in putting together his latest PC budget. Here's my conversation via Zoom with the Liberal Party finance critic Fred Tilley right now. And we're pleased to welcome back to Tilley Community Television a frequent guest on our series Roundtable. He is the Liberal caucus chair for Nova Scotia. He's also the party's finance critic and the MLA for the riding of Northside Westmount. We're pleased to welcome Fred Tilley from his office in Halifax today. Fred, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Adam. It's always a pleasure.
We know this is a busy day for you in your role as finance critic. We're catching you as Finance Minister Alan McMaster is getting ready to release his budget. Obviously, we can't speak too much to the specific details, but what is your sense going into all of this in terms of the directions that the government has been giving and the signals it's been giving in terms of how it wants to do its spending this year?
Well, I think some of the signals that we've seen over the last number of days in the legislature and the last number of weeks of announcements is, the government is really focusing on healthcare and trying to make investments in the healthcare system that will make things better. We recently saw an announcement on retention of healthcare workers. We support the fact that we want to retain our healthcare workers, certainly. I believe there's been some logistical situations with that, with a lot of employees who are left out of that retention bonus, such as those on maternity or those off on workplace injuries or sickness, as well as a big group of people in our healthcare system who are casual employees who are working full-time hours supporting our system, working all through COVID and haven't landed that full-time job yet. They're left out of this retention bonus. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. One of the things that I would say with the increased spending over the last 2 years that we've seen in the healthcare area is that we're not seeing the results. So we're not seeing, all of the metrics will tell us that things are getting worse. So the doctor wait list has doubled. The promise to meet surgical wait times within 18 months of their election has failed. So the wait lists are growing for surgeries. The wait lists are growing for a family doctor. We're approaching 140,000 Nova Scotians on that list. So we're seeing lots of money being spent, but we're not seeing the results of that money improving the metrics of healthcare.
You referenced the retention bonuses, and of course, that's the $10,000 bonus for nurses that not only sign on, but that nurses that stay within the system here in Nova Scotia. There's been some discussion that it's one thing to say that a retention bonus is provided, and it's quite another thing to say that the government is simply throwing money at the problem. Tim Houston and his finance minister, Alan McMaster, both saying they're prepared to keep spending and going into deficit budgets to try to address these issues. Your thoughts on the idea of spending, but also the possibility that there could be spending happening without actual direction here?
Well, that's the big issue that we see. So spending with an outcome in mind and a target and a plan is one thing, but throwing money at the wall to see what is going to stick, that's an irresponsible way to spend money. So the fact that we're spending these money, creating these deficits, is we're setting up future generations to pay back this debt over their lifetime. So we see high inflation at right now. I think we're at 5.7%, still well above the Canadian average in Nova Scotia. So people's spending power is decreasing. Their income taxes are increasing. And any money that they're receiving from a cost of living payment from either their employer or the government is getting chewed up in the fact that we won't index tax brackets in Nova Scotia. So Nova Scotians are actually paying more. Yesterday in the legislature, I did a review for the minister as we were put our bill in to index income tax rates, Nova Scotians pay the highest taxes provincially in all of Atlantic Canada. And there was a report released yesterday, I think by the Fraser Institute, that indicated that we're number 2 in all of North America in the way we do our provincial taxation. So that's not something to be proud of. This is something that's easily rectified. We're seeing lots of spending on healthcare initiatives that they deem appropriate, but we're not seeing anything for average everyday Nova Scotians. So there's nothing there to help Nova Scotians as their spending power goes down, their income taxes go up, and they're left, unfortunately, holding the bag at the end of the day.
Now, your party introduced 2 pieces of legislation earlier this week to try to deal with the healthcare issue and try to be able to address some of these problems that we've been seeing, the growing wait list for those looking for a family doctor, vacancies in emergency rooms, not just in Cape Breton, but across the province. Can you tell us a little bit about the approach that your party is taking with these new pieces of legislation introduced by the Liberals earlier this week?
Well, so a couple of things that, we think are appropriate. And one that I will certainly talk about with regards to healthcare is the fact of the preventive care can really help to improve our wait lists, and it can help to improve our overuse on our emergency rooms. So through consultation with the Diabetes Association of Canada, many advocates, a young man in Glace Bay who's been advocating for the payment of glucose monitoring systems for Nova Scotians, would significantly help people manage their chronic disease, which would then reduce the amount of pressure on our system. It would reduce the amount of trips to the ER. It could reduce the amount of medications. So as an example to what we've seen there is an example of a young man who was a football player for St. FX and had worked hard that day, had a good meal, had everything he would normally do, went to bed that night and went into a low. And his mom in Glace Bay received the message on her phone, and it saved her life. So when we look at these glucose monitoring systems, the government is, and they timed us out yesterday. They wouldn't even let it come to a vote, which is very disappointing. They timed it out because these systems, in my opinion, are not a frivolous expense. They're not, they are more, I kind of use the analogy of it's almost like a pacemaker. So a pacemaker is there to help sustain life. This glucose monitoring system is monitoring your blood sugar every millisecond, and it's going to others. So when you're having that low and you don't realize it, someone else can save your life. So it's really a life-saving piece of equipment. And if you think about the humane and convenient side of this, can you imagine waking your child up through the night to prick their finger to get a blood glucose reading, so you can make sure that that they're going to be okay through the night. An average type 1 person has to prick their finger up to 10 times a day in order to maintain, and the cost of $88 per 100 strips. So, at the end of the day, if we're going to be spending money, we can spend money to put back into improving healthcare outcomes.
Let's shift gears a little bit, Fred Tilley. You are the Liberal Party's caucus chair for Nova Scotia. So can you give me a sense on what the mood is in the caucus as this new legislature session begins? Obviously, budget day is just one day. What are you feeling both as a caucus and as a party as you head into this latest legislature session for the spring?
Well, look, we feel that we've developed some really good pieces of legislation to bring forward to the legislature that will help improve the lives of Nova Scotians. And that's what really this job is all about. So our job is about, yes, doing our constituency work, and making sure we support and help our constituents. But where we can make the biggest impact is when we're creating laws and changing laws that are antiquated so that we can now improve the economic outlook, the health outlook, the housing outlook, all of these things that affect Nova Scotians daily. So the mood in our caucus is a very positive mood. We feel that we've done a lot of hard work in research, wonderful policies that we're putting forward. The hard part for us is that the government is not interested in a lot of these policies. They're more interested in whatever their own agenda is and becoming reelected in 4 years. So they're not a forward-looking or a long-term looking government. They're more looking over that election cycle, is what we're seeing. So from our perspective, we're gonna lobby hard to get these bills in place. We just as an example, one was the glucose monitoring system. The other two were measures more financially that I put through on Tuesday, I believe, which were about income tax bracket creep, which is very important, and also cutting the motor fuel tax. So we know that the government, because of the price of fuel right now, the government is pulling in motor fuel tax at a significantly higher rate than normal. And we're suggesting that they suspend this tax for a period of time in order to give Nova Scotians a break at the pumps. So what we've seen from this government is a lot of, they'll talk about the $1,000 HARP rebate, they'll talk about the senior care grant, all great initiatives that we support. But if you listen to Minister McMaster, when we proposed that they give people more money, he indicated that if we just hand out checks, all we're going to do is increase inflation. But in the end, because they want to make it their own, they do hand out checks. But the things that they're doing are not helping all Nova Scotians. They're targeted, but a cut in the fuel tax will help everybody, from the small business owner that's running one taxi cab. It will help improve deliveries. It'll help improve all kinds of things outside of our own personal gas consumption.
And I imagine that you're looking at this kind of a pitch with an eye to the imposition of the federal carbon tax in Nova Scotia this coming summer, slated to raise gas prices by 14 cents a liter. So is that part of the party's thinking in terms of being able to bring prices down now?
Well, and this savings that we're proposing would be approximately 14 to 15 cents a liter. But that piece that you're speaking about with the federal carbon tax is another bone of contention in Nova Scotia. For many years under the previous Liberal government, the government developed their own program for carbon, negotiated with the federal government, and only added 1 cent per liter through a cap and trade system. Now the current government has scrapped that system, and if I'm sure you followed some of the correspondence in the news back and forth over the last year, where they didn't submit their proposal on time, and so what we see there is they want this tax in Nova Scotia, the provincial PC government. We're calling it a PC tax because they could have negotiated a better deal for Nova Scotians, but this government is all about blame. They want to be able to blame the federal government. They want to be able to blame the provincial Liberal Party for not standing up to the federal government. We voted no for the carbon tax. So what we're seeing is more reaction and no proaction. So this government is not going out and advocating on behalf of Nova Scotians when it comes to carbon.
Fred Tilley, thank you for joining us once again here on Tell Community Television.
Thank you, Adam. Take care.
Fred Tilley is the MLA for Northside Westmount. He is also the caucus chair for the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia and the party's finance critic. And there you have it. That wraps up this week's edition of Roundtable. Thank you for tuning in, and a special thanks to my interview guests this week, Fred Tilley and Veronica Merryfield. And a big thank you to our guest interviewer, Taylor Linloff. Special thanks as well to my colleagues here at Tilley Community Television, Nick Boudreau and Callan Cowan, for filming and formatting the studio footage that you're seeing on this week's show. And a big thank you as well to my interview guests from the Strait Area Chamber of Commerce's State of the Strait Conference in Port Hawkesbury. If you have any thoughts about what you've seen over the past hour, or just suggestions for future editions of Roundtable, feel free to contact me directly or to contact Tilley Community Television here in Arishat. And be sure to follow Tilley on social media. For now, I'm Adam Cook. Thank you once again for joining me this week on Roundtable. I look forward to seeing you again next week with a brand new show. Bye for now.